The silence was deafening. On a live broadcast watched by millions, Rachel Reeves, Labour's so-called financial genius, sat frozen, her words caught in her throat as a ruthless interviewer dismantled her credibility in real time. This wasn't just another political Q&A. This was a full-scale exposure. Facts flew like bullets, and Reeves had no armour, no witty comeback, no rehearsed rebuttal. She blinked, swallowed, and stumbled as her own numbers betrayed her. What was meant to be a confident defence of Labour's controversial budget turned into one of the most humiliating on-air implosions of her career. And make no mistake, the damage wasn't just to her image, it was to every thread Labour has tried to weave into their already crumbling narrative. This isn't a gaffe, it's a political explosion, and Rachel Reeves is standing right at the centre of it. It began as a routine political interview. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor turned face of Labour's financial policies, took her seat with the usual air of confidence. She had weathered tough questions before. She had faced critics, hostile press and opposition MPs without so much as breaking a sweat. But today was different. What she didn't expect was the sheer precision with which the interviewer was prepared to corner her. The atmosphere shifted, almost instantly. There were no softballs, no gentle preambles, just hard facts, sharp questions, and an interviewer who smelled blood. The first strike came fast. The interviewer opened the manifesto on live television, flipping through the pages with theatrical disdain. "Chancellor," he said sharply, "where in this document does it say you're raising spending by 74 billion and hiking taxes by 40 billion? Because I've looked, and I can't find it." A chilling pause followed. Reeves stuttered, fumbled, and then repeated a familiar line, something about a $22 billion overspend inherited from the previous government. But this time the line didn't land. It didn't even make a dent. The interviewer fired back, armed with specific figures and Treasury documents that contradicted her narrative. The mask slipped. For a few seconds, the woman once hailed as Labour's iron calculator looked completely devastatingly lost. What made this moment so damning wasn't just that Reeves was caught off guard, it was that she had no escape route. Every attempted pivot led her deeper into the hole. The interviewer pressed on, referencing Labour's own budget documents, campaign speeches and public statements, systematically exposing every contradiction. The $22 billion black hole she kept mentioning was revealed to be a calculated deflection. According to the interviewer's sources, and they were solid, much of that so-called shortfall was due to Labour's own rushed decisions after taking office. Settlement of public sector pay disputes, means-testing winter fuel payments, unplanned injections into the NHS, all of it added up. And none of it was accounted for in the manifesto. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was incriminating. Viewers watched as Reeves tried to explain how they went from promising modest spending increases to unleashing the biggest tax-raising budget since 1993. But every word made things worse. "This wasn't the budget I expected to deliver," she admitted, a line that might go down in history as the moment Labour's credibility started to unravel. Because if the Chancellor didn't know the real state of the economy before the election, what exactly did Labour run on? Dreams, assumptions, or lies? As the segment continued, public outrage began bubbling online. Social media exploded. Clips from the interview went viral within minutes. People weren't just disappointed, they were furious. This wasn't what they voted for. They didn't back Labour just to see their taxes spike, their pensions targeted, and their cost of living climb even higher. And they certainly didn't expect to be fed excuses that collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. But Reeves wasn't finished digging. In a desperate attempt to justify the tax hikes, she blamed the previous Conservative government for failing to conduct a thorough spending review. She then listed a series of liabilities, including the infected blood compensation scheme and the Post Office Horizon scandal, that hadn't been properly budgeted for. But again, the interviewer was ready. "Are you seriously saying that none of this was foreseeable?" he asked coldly. "That your entire economic strategy is based on being blindsided?" The fallout from Rachel Reeves's on-air collapse was immediate and ferocious. Within hours, political analysts across the country were describing it as a career-defining moment, but not in the way Labour had hoped. This wasn't a minor stumble or a misunderstood quote. This was a public unravelling of Labour's financial plan delivered in prime time with nowhere to hide. As the clip continued to circulate like wildfire, the headlines began writing themselves. Reeves exposed, Labour's budget bombshell, and the most brutal of all, tax and confuse. What became clear almost instantly was that this wasn't just an embarrassment for Reeves. It was a seismic crack in Labour's already fragile authority. Behind the scenes, panic began to ripple through Labour HQ. Advisers scrambled to contain the damage, but the truth was clear. They had lost control of the narrative. The party that had promised stability was now lurching from one economic controversy to the next, with their chancellor being publicly dismantled by hard facts. Internal leaks began spilling into the press. Senior Labour MPs, many of whom had already expressed private concerns over Reeves's aggressive tax plans, were furious. Some reportedly demanded emergency meetings, questioning whether she was fit to handle the Treasury going forward. Others began distancing themselves from her remarks altogether, afraid of being dragged down in the wreckage. But the real storm was happening outside the Labour bubble. Voters who had trusted Labour to ease their financial burdens were now watching their expectations implode. Pensioners were horrified at the quiet scrapping of national insurance relief, a move that experts warned could amount to a stealth tax on retirement. Small business owners bristled at the planned increase in corporation tax, while middle-income families feared the ripple effects of Labour's $40 billion tax rise. And as if that wasn't enough, whispers began spreading that even fuel duties, long considered politically untouchable, were back on the table for future budgets. It was as if every red line Labour had promised not to cross was being erased, one by one. Meanwhile, Reform UK seized the moment like wolves circling a wounded rival. Nigel Farage and Richard Tice wasted no time, launching blistering attacks across social media and news outlets. They labelled Reeves a fraud, accused Labour of betraying working-class voters, and pushed a single devastating message: Labour lied. Their surge in the polls, already noticeable in recent weeks, accelerated dramatically. Constituencies once considered safe Labour strongholds began flipping in projection models. Reform rallies grew larger, their donations swelled, and their message was clear. Labour had become the very thing it swore to oppose, a party of broken promises and fiscal betrayal. Keir Starmer's silence in the wake of the interview only made things worse. While his chancellor burned under public scrutiny, the Labour leader appeared indecisive and evasive, issuing a vague statement about unexpected challenges without addressing the root of the crisis. That silence was interpreted not as leadership, but cowardice. Within Labour ranks, murmurs of discontent began to swell. Some MPs argued that Starmer's refusal to publicly back Reeves was a betrayal in itself, while others saw it as a strategic distancing move, a clear signal that she could be sacrificed to protect the party's long-term survival. But the real twist came when multiple sources began confirming what had long been feared. Labour's internal projections were far worse than publicly acknowledged. According to leaked memos, their original budget had underestimated the cost of several public sector deals, misjudged GDP growth, and ignored inflationary risks tied to international trade instability. In other words, Labour didn't just make a mistake, they built their economic platform on a foundation of fantasy. And now that fantasy was crumbling in full view of a nation already on edge, financial experts lined up on news panels to tear into the numbers. "It's amateur hour at the Treasury," said one analyst. "They promised a fully costed plan, but what they've delivered is a patchwork of half-truths and hidden liabilities." The Office for Budget Responsibility remained tight-lipped, but off-the-record briefings suggested serious concern about Labour's assumptions. Even the Bank of England reportedly raised eyebrows at Reeves's plans, with speculation swirling that interest rates could rise again if markets sensed further instability. For Labour, the timing couldn't have been worse. The political honeymoon was already over, and the British public, worn down by years of economic strain, were in no mood for apologies. The sense of betrayal was raw. Labour hadn't just failed to fix the problem, they had become the problem. The opposition, led by Reform UK, capitalised on this rage, branding themselves as the only party willing to speak uncomfortable truths and make tough decisions. Their message resonated, and as the days wore on, one phrase kept surfacing in conversations across the country. We were conned. But perhaps the most chilling consequence of Reeves's televised collapse was the psychological shift it triggered within her own party. Labour had always projected unity, at least outwardly, but after this, the cracks began to split wide open. Rebel MPs, already frustrated with Starmer's centrist pivot and Reeves's economic rigidity, saw their chance to strike. A handful began openly praising Reform's honest approach, while others hinted at crossbench alliances. The idea that Labour could fracture, once unthinkable, was now being whispered in Parliament's corridors, and in the shadows of all this chaos, one word began echoing louder and louder in the media, the markets, and the minds of millions: election, not a scheduled one. Not a comfortable, distant inevitability. A shock election. A collapse of confidence so profound that Labour might be forced to return to the ballot box, not out of choice, but necessity. As Labour staggered under the weight of economic missteps and crumbling credibility, the momentum rapidly shifted away from them. Reform UK, previously dismissed by mainstream pundits as a protest party, was now basking in the glow of unexpected legitimacy. The public, enraged and betrayed, began flocking to them in droves, not out of blind loyalty, but out of desperation. And nothing fuels political upheaval faster than a desperate electorate. Constituency polls that had once been predictable suddenly turned volatile. Red wall seats, which Labour had fought so hard to win back, were slipping again. Only this time, not to the Tories, but to a new threat that spoke with unfiltered conviction. The chaos surrounding Labour didn't stay confined to interviews and headlines. It erupted in Parliament like wildfire. MPs who had once campaigned shoulder to shoulder were now at each other's throats behind closed doors. A string of resignations from mid-level Labour officials sent a chilling signal. The sinking ship had sprung too many leaks. Several prominent backbenchers delivered damning speeches, cloaked in parliamentary politeness, but loaded with unmistakable venom. Phrases like disillusioned with the direction of the party, out of touch with working people, and failure to deliver clarity were repeated like mantras. The unity Keir Starmer had so carefully manufactured over the past 2 years was vanishing, fast. Starmer, caught between defending his Chancellor and preserving his own leadership, appeared paralysed. His public appearances became increasingly rare, and when he did speak, his words felt rehearsed, robotic, devoid of the urgency the crisis demanded. Every delay, every non-answer, every carefully constructed statement designed to calm the markets only further enraged the voters. In politics, silence can be strategic, but in times of collapse, it sounds like cowardice, and the people could smell fear. Behind the scenes, whispers turned into open conversations among party insiders. Names of potential successors to Starmer began circulating, not in fringe circles, but among influential donors and party organisers. Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting, and even Angela Rayner were floated as possible replacements, not because they were particularly ready, but because Labour's base was begging for anyone who could stop the bleeding. The question was no longer if Labour would lose control, but when. Internal party documents leaked to select journalists revealed that several constituencies were already preparing for emergency re-election strategies. The implication was unmistakable. They were bracing for an early election, triggered by a total collapse in confidence. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party, though battered and still unpopular from years of internal divisions, watched with interest. They hadn't expected a comeback this soon, but they were preparing nonetheless. Senior Tory strategists quietly began crafting counter-narratives, emphasising responsible governance and fiscal realism, knowing that the electorate was once again ripe for a message of stability. But the real threat to Labour wasn't the Conservatives. It was Reform UK, and their rapid transformation from political outsiders to serious contenders was the stuff of political nightmares. Their rallies began to draw thousands. Their slogans were printed on car windows, pub banners, and online ads. They weren't just visible, they were viral. The tipping point came when one high-profile Labour MP, long rumoured to be discontent with the party's leadership, announced their defection to Reform UK live on air. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. The MP delivered a fiery statement condemning Labour's betrayal of the working class, their manipulative budget strategies, and their arrogance in the face of honest scrutiny. The visual of a seated Reform leader beside the newly defected MP sent shockwaves through political media. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a signal. And within 48 hours, 2 more Labour MPs followed suit. This was no longer a policy dispute or a communications crisis. This was a mutiny. The pressure on Starmer reached boiling point. For days, reports circulated that senior figures within the party were urging him to call a vote of confidence to silence the dissent once and for all. But Starmer hesitated, aware that such a move could backfire spectacularly. In the absence of leadership, panic spread like fire. Campaign managers couldn't plan, donors were pulling back, and Labour councils across the country began openly, pleading for guidance. No one knew what the party stood for anymore, except perhaps for damage control and confusion. At the heart of this political storm, the British public found themselves in a surreal moment. Just months earlier, Labour had seemed unstoppable, poised to take power with a comfortable majority. But now, everything was upside down. Reform UK was promising lower taxes, tighter immigration control, and a clampdown on corruption, messages that resonated with disillusioned voters. And they were delivering these messages with unapologetic clarity, something Labour was rapidly losing the ability to do. The demand for a general election became deafening. Public pressure mounted as media headlines demanded answers. Will Starmer survive? Is Labour imploding? Reform surge forces election countdown. The Prime Minister could no longer ignore the elephant in the room. Starmer's authority was diminished, his party fractured, and his Chancellor a national punchline. And then, in a dramatic twist, insiders confirmed what many had suspected for days. Labour was preparing for a possible emergency election. The key speculation turned to shock when Parliament insiders leaked that private meetings between party leaders and the Speaker had taken place. The topic, a potential no-confidence motion, led not by the opposition, but by rebel MPs within Labour itself. The government was eating itself from the inside, and Starmer, once the embodiment of calm control, was now a man cornered by his own allies. As the prospect of an emergency election loomed, the political environment in the UK grew more volatile by the day. With each passing hour, the damage to Labour's reputation became more evident. Starmer's previously controlled public image was now in tatters, shredded by the relentless infighting within his own party and the unrelenting rise of Reform UK. It seemed as though the very foundation of Labour's credibility was eroding, and the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Labour MPs, once steadfast in their loyalty to the leader, were now beginning to question whether supporting Starmer's faltering leadership was worth the cost to their own political futures. With each resignation, the pressure on Starmer intensified, and whispers of a leadership contest began to surface, threatening to tear the party apart from within. Public perception of the Labour Party was deteriorating rapidly. The anger and frustration of the electorate, fueled by years of broken promises and economic mismanagement, reached a boiling point. The narrative that had once seemed so favourable to Labour, one of hope, progress and change, was now twisted into one of betrayal, failure and chaos. Reform UK capitalised on this vulnerability, positioning themselves as the alternative to a Labour Party that could no longer even manage its own affairs. Their message, once relegated to the fringes, was now being heard by millions of voters, who had grown tired of the political establishment. It was a message that resonated with those who felt left behind by both the Tories and Labour, and it was gaining momentum by the day. In this atmosphere of rising tension, the Labour Party's internal divisions became more pronounced. Senior figures, many of whom had once been the most vocal supporters of Starmer's leadership, began to openly criticise his handling of the crisis. Some suggested that Starmer's leadership had been too weak, that his failure to address the growing divisions within the party had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. Others, perhaps even more damning, questioned whether Starmer's economic policies were truly the answer to the country's problems. In a series of off-the-record briefings, Labour's most prominent MPs expressed doubts about Starmer's ability to lead the party to victory, with some even claiming that he had lost touch with the concerns of ordinary voters. For Starmer, the mounting pressure was unbearable. His attempts to manage the crisis through carefully worded statements and political spin only seemed to make matters worse. The public, which had once viewed him as a steady hand amid the chaos of the Brexit years, now saw him as just another politician trying to paper over the cracks in a crumbling system. The scandals and defections were too much to ignore, and with every passing day it became increasingly clear that Starmer's leadership was on borrowed time. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the conversation within Labour had shifted from crisis management to survival. Key figures within the party began to discuss the possibility of a leadership change, with some suggesting that the only way for Labour to recover would be to replace Starmer with someone more capable of winning back the support of the electorate. Names like Lisa Nandy and Wes Streeting were floated as potential replacements, and the party's most influential figures began to weigh the pros and cons of a leadership contest. The question, however, remained whether such a change could be made in time to save Labour from the looming electoral disaster. For Starmer, the situation seemed increasingly dire. His leadership was under siege from all sides, and the party's future was on the line. His attempt to hold together the fractured party only served to expose just how deep the divisions ran. At a time when Labour should have been rallying behind a common cause, the infighting and defections continued unabated. The cracks in Starmer's leadership were becoming too obvious to ignore, and his position at the top was becoming increasingly untenable. As the days went on, Reform UK continued to gain ground. Their rallies grew larger, their message clearer, and their influence undeniable. What had once been a fringe movement was now a formidable political force, one that was capturing the imagination of voters who had long been disillusioned by the AMIO's mainstream parties. Reform UK's rise was fuelled not just by their opposition to Labour, but by the palpable sense of opportunity they presented. They were seen as a party that could offer something new, something different from the tired political establishment that had failed the British people for so long. And in a political landscape defined by frustration and disillusionment, that was an incredibly powerful position to be in. By the time Labour's internal turmoil reached its peak, Reform UK had successfully positioned itself as the main alternative to both Labour and the Tories. Their message of fiscal responsibility, strong borders, and opposition to the political elite resonated with a broad cross-section of voters, and their rise in the polls was a clear indication that the British public was ready for change. In key battleground constituencies, Reform UK was now challenging Labour directly, and in some cases even surpassing them. It was becoming increasingly clear that Reform UK was no longer a protest party. They were a serious player in the UK's political future. As Labour scrambled to salvage its credibility, Starmer found himself in a precarious position. His leadership was under attack from all sides, and the party was facing a potential meltdown. The pressure to act, either by reshuffling his team or by calling an emergency election, was immense. Yet every move he made seemed to make matters worse. His calls for unity within the party were ignored, and his carefully crafted policy proposals were met with scepticism. Meanwhile, Reform UK surged forward, their rise seemingly unstoppable. The political crisis in the UK had reached its breaking point. Labour, once the dominant force in British politics, was now facing an existential crisis. Starmer's leadership was in ruins, and the party's future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Reform UK was ready to seize the moment, and the political landscape was about to be irrevocably changed. The countdown to an election had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. As the political landscape continues to shift, It's clear that the UK's future is on the edge of a major transformation. The breakdown within the Labour Party, Starmer's faltering leadership, and the rise of Reform UK are reshaping the political fabric of the nation. This crisis is far from over, and the consequences for the future of British politics are profound. What do you think? Will Starmer be able to turn things around, or is Labour's time in power coming to an end? Will Reform UK take the opportunity to make history, or is this just the beginning of a much larger political realignment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on this ongoing political drama. The next chapter in the UK's political saga is just around the corner. Stay tuned for more updates on this ever-evolving story.